Mara Boon, who actually holds multiple positions. But for today, I've asked her to be the member of the Australia-Brazil Chamber of Commerce. We have Dr. Michael Roberts here directly. Hello, directly to my right. The Chief Scientist for CSIRO for Agriculture and Food Systems, and last but not least, Kostas Stavris, who is the Chief Commercial Officer for Ruminate, a technology company based in actually WA, the far west of Australia, and making some great impact and inroads to reducing methane in animals, and with big partnerships in Brazil. So welcome. 50-minute panel. I'm going to ask questions, and hopefully some discussions will ensue. So I'm going to kick off with Mara. So Mara, why is Australia and Brazil so important in the global production of agriculture goods, and how can the two regions learn from each other, and why are the two regions so important in this conversation around climate solutions?
Thank you very much. Can you hear? Yay! You have to eat the microphone. They're not very good. It's not very comfortable, but it works. So let me just offer some high-level comments on scale, structure, and complementarity, because I do believe these two great southern nations actually have aligned net zero pathways which are investable across and between borders. On the question of scale, of course, Australians would be aware we are, 70% of our product is exported. We have a very big role to play in feeding particularly Southeast Asia, but all over the world, very strong export sector. And a lot of our land is used for cattle grazing. And so there's a land use, sort of reality in Australia. The total product, and we have a massive Indigenous protest outside, so we'll have lots of helicopters overhead. I'll leave to my wonderful economist who will ground these facts and details, but imagine that Brazil is much, much bigger in terms of its product than Australia. And we have some similar export markets, but Brazil is very strong on some commodities, which Australia, is kind of experiment like soy and cane and oranges and coffee, and we know all those stories. There are more cows in Brazil than there are people. And there are many people in Brazil. And in Australia, of course, we have the almighty grains industry with the WA wheat belt and the grains across New South Wales. We have cane. We have legendary quality in our meat systems. We have an imperative around sustainability, which is fast growing. That imperative is also real for Brazil, not only because offshore markets are demanding it, but because it actually turns out to align to productivity in terms of soil quality, soil health, etc. On the structure side, I might also add, as a proportion of GDP, just to get your head around this, for Australia, agriculture altogether is less than, I think, 3%. For Brazil, it's nearly a quarter of GDP, right? So it really is a global powerhouse. And in terms of market structure, again, some similarities, but some differences. Although we do have in Australia some small and medium farms that are very important in terms of our value chains, we also have some large integrated systems, and on average, the size of the farm can be quite large. And think about those huge grazing properties, right, that cross vast areas. In Brazil, you can imagine that 90% of the farms actually are small and medium-sized family farms, and they produce 50% of the value. And a very small number of huge commercial operations complement the 50%. But what I think is important to understand, the commonality and also the subtle differences, in Brazil, because of course the big difference is the socioeconomic development, right? Those small and medium-sized farms depend on healthy farming systems for their families, for their culture, for their nutrition, for their prosperity, really. And so the social fabric of Brazilian farming is just vast and deep and huge, very, very important. That is true also in Australia, but I think I would argue the commercial thing's a little bit different. The final point is both countries are trying to up the productivity leveraging technology. And in Brazil, the prevalence of smartphones on even the smallest farms is now quite real. And the reporting and the data required to participate also is increasing. In Australia, of course, we have probably a bigger take-up of robotics, digital technologies. We'll be hearing a really exciting technology story. But I'll leave by saying I'm super excited by the possibility that in the same way as Australia's mining, engineering, and technology services, the MET sector, which has a much bigger multiplier effect than mining itself, our METS companies are very active in Brazil. Dozens have headquarters here. They're powering mining, critical mining in Brazil. In that same way, I really hope Australian ag tech will find a really fruitful home here. And I do believe we're going to see large-scale investment between the two companies on actual farmland.
Great. Pradeep.
Thanks. Heach, can I add to that? I think
Yeah.
in this world now dominated by geopolitical shifts, how we think about supply chains could be really important for us in terms of how Australia and Brazil interact. Not only will there be a lot of economics of knowledge transfer and technology transfer that'll take place both ways, I think in terms of global supply chains, thinking about food, I think there's a very important reason why Australia and Brazil should probably get together a lot more than we currently do.
And before we flip back, because we could talk about this forever, this is such an exciting conversation. In addition to the supply chain, complementarity and collaboration, there is the ability to hedge climate trends. And for an Australian agricultural system so exposed to droughts and floods, the ability to leverage Brazil's relatively stable climate, high productivity levels is super exciting.
Yeah, and I would add that in my past role working at Macquarie, we had investments in Brazil and in Australia for that very reason. The strategy was to diversify climate exposure and to hedge not only the climate but also commodity exposure. So there was, if you as an institutional owner of large-scale assets in land, you know, you might create a portfolio with these multiple regions that have those diversification benefits. But sticking to the Brazil-Australia relationship for a moment, I just want to tap into Michael's knowledge here on science. You mentioned science and technology. So beyond the 2019 MOU, which was really to reflect formalised a cooperative agreement between CSIRO in Australia and Brazil, why is that important? Why are the two countries and their cooperation across scientific development important for this particular asset class, Michael?
Yeah, thanks, Heach. I just want to step back a bit and just underscore what Mara and Pradeep are saying about the role of technology in underpinning productivity growth. And you only have to look in Australia at our different industries within the ag sector, and you can see a very clear link between technology development and adoption and the productivity that you see in those industries. And unfortunately, the flip side of that, industries that are struggling with productivity growth are often the ones who are not investing in technology and are struggling to get it adopted. So technology plays a really key role here, I think. And the agricultural revolution in Brazil, of course, has been taken on off the back of wonderful technology development and adoption. And Embrapa have had a big role to play in that, as well as some of the big multinational companies. There's actually, interestingly, some Australian technology that's quite important in the Brazilian ag sector, which is in their cotton industry. We have quite a bit of delivery of cotton germplasm into the Brazilian industry based on Australian breeding. But getting back to your original question, Heach, as Mara said, there's so much commonality the two countries have, but we also have complementarities. So often it's hard to collaborate when you're really similar to each other, because there's not much in it, right? And often you're competitors actually, if you're really alike. But if you've got enough that's different from each other, then that often incentivizes collaboration. And I think there's a big opportunity for us to take a greater step into that opportunity. I think the MOU hasn't really taken off, unfortunately. I think COVID was a bit of an issue there, that stalled things, as it did for many of our other bilateral relationships. So I don't think that's unique to Brazil. But I see some great opportunities around us leaning into this issue around how do you transition to a lower emissions farming system. And I think there's some common science questions that underpin the Brazilian context and the Australian context. What are the sorts of technologies, systems, data that's required to do that? And another area I think we have a great opportunity to collaborate is how do we manage farms going to the future when they are faced with increasing climate variability, with increasing seasonal volatility, and what are the sort of science and technology systems that you can develop that will help both countries be more robust at handling that, because that's really the reality of climate change for many farmers, is how am I going to manage more ups and downs that I see on my farm and manage to still stay in business and be ready to weather the next storm when it comes.
Thank you, Michael. And, for countries like Australia and Brazil, where agriculture is such a significant component to not only the GDP, but also to the psyche and culture of those nations. I just wanted to touch base with Pradeep for a moment. Deloitte wrote an article, and the headline was "Building the Lucky Country." And you nominated the sector as one of the Fantastic Five. Can you unpack that a little bit for us, and why Deloitte's felt that the ag sector was a critical sector that could overtake the mining industry as a key sector, a resources sector for Australia?
Sure thing. Can I just make one comment, Michael, on that question of technology and complementarity? Doesn't have to be a barrier. The 2025 Nobel Prize winner in economics, John Lockyer, one of his great contributions was to also highlight the importance of cooperation and competition in the technology game. And it's that idea of cooperation seems to have dropped off for many, many years in our way of thinking about the economics of innovation. And so
the Americans taught me a new word a few years ago, Philip, co-opetition.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. As only the Americans can do, right?
Absolutely.
New compound nouns.
Totally mangle the English language, but that's all right. Heech, it's really important when we think about Australian agriculture, where we have great comparative and competitive advantages. We have vast amounts of arable land, which we don't usually use to compete for things like urban sprawl. In a lot of other countries, the land conflict is often agriculture versus urban. We don't really have that. We have other conflicts that emerged that Mara raised earlier in her opening comments. So on this comparative advantage side, we have lots of land that's arable. We don't compete as much. But we then have on the competitive side some things Michael talked about. We have this enormous amount of technology. We have a highly educated workforce. Again, quite different in characteristic to a lot of other countries in the world when we think about agriculture. And the last bit is, as a small open country, we have benefited so much from globalization and free trade. Now, some of that is in a little bit of retreat now, but I think we can get smart around thinking about supply chains going forward. And the really important reason why we're so optimistic about agriculture for Australia is you look at the big demand drivers, particularly to the north of us on our doorstep. High population growth, highest incomes growth, the move towards greater nutrition. I mean, one of the tragedies about our predicament today is that there are some 730 million people around this planet who are undernourished, who are not getting the calories they need to thrive. And so the demand for high caloric, high protein food is growing because awareness is growing and because demand is following. And so for us, we think that is an enormous pull factor for Australia, drawing on these comparative and competitive advantages.
Thank you, Pradeep. And, and I think it's a nice segue into Costa's business, because what you've highlighted are the macro tailwinds, which is why institutional investors are looking at this asset class. Growing population, urbanisation, and the calorific needs of emerging nations. But one of the, and that's why red meat production is not going to disappear overnight. And countries like Australia and Brazil, it's incredibly important for the people that farm the land here. But of course, it's also the single source of the greatest emissions for the sector. So Costa's business, which I'll let Costa explain what his business is, but it is a feed additive to reduce methane, but at the same time, the compelling commercial, carrot for farmers is that it will increase productivity in the animals, which obviously means you can turn them off earlier and actually reduce your methane impact. But there's a lot of feed additives in the making in the market. There's the seaweed, the red asparagopsis. Yours is different, your product. Would like to hear a bit more. And a real sort of question I have is, do you think that's the silver bullet that the red meat production systems need in order to meet the climate demand?
Thank you, H. So Ruminate is an Australian ag tech company. We're developing feed additives for cattle that interrupt methane production and make more energy available for the animal to increase its growth in the form of more milk or more beef. It's particularly important and symbolic to be here in Brazil at the same time when there's such a gigantic beef industry. There's more than a fifth of the world's commercial cattle population here in Brazil, and so it's a significant part of the Brazilian footprint. It's a significant part of the Australian footprint. And our technology is quite exciting. I mean, we've released some public papers that have peer-reviewed science showing the results that we've been able to achieve, and we've seen in two of our published papers, we've seen 95% and 93% methane reductions in cattle. So the beauty of this is you can achieve quite a high impact almost instantaneously in beef and dairy farming systems. When you're addressing methane with a very high heating impact in the next 20 years, this is a very important part of the climate puzzle to address, especially because of the timing impact in the race towards the targets by 2050. So the other thing that a lot of people don't understand is how big the challenge is. Methane from cattle represents more than 2 gigatons of emissions of the global footprint. That's about 4% of the global footprint, and it comes from a single biological system, which is the digestive system of the cattle. So by cracking the science of reducing methane in the rumen has a potentially enormous opportunity to accelerate our progress. Now, are feed additives the silver bullet? The short answer is no, they're not. And that's because we have a lot of cattle, and they live in very diverse production systems. Everything from smallholder farmers with 2 to 10 cattle all the way to 100,000 head feedlots. And the needs of those farming systems are really diverse. So where do feed additives fit in? They're a very effective, very immediate solution for intensive farming systems. But it's not enough, because you've got to go reach the rangeland cattle as well. And so we're developing technologies that can do that too. The reason why it's not necessarily a silver bullet is because farmers need choices. And what I see is the stacking of technologies over time. So we'll probably see selective breeding programs for cattle. we'll probably see vaccines, different feed management systems, as well as feed additives. And those emissions reductions may stack and accumulate to try to get us a big dent. And so
Thank you. I think certainly CFC of the lifetime has invested directly, $750 million into the ag sector, and we know that it is a technology stacking solve. Not one solution for all, and farmers having choice is absolutely critical to that. And I guess a question for you, Michael. Agriculture, unlike many other sectors, we sort of think of all sort of sectors as a supply chain in a sort of a linear fashion. But in the ag sector, you're dealing with land-based interventions, which has a circularity to it. So the potential to utilise better production systems on farm and utilise technologies in a way to, look at better manage the circularity of a farming system is something I'm really keen to understand whether CSIRO is, how you approach that from a technology perspective. And when you think of the green revolution and the incredible increase in yield gains through cropping systems with fertiliser, which is now one of the big causes of emissions for farm, what do you think is the next green revolution for this sector?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I totally agree with what Constance is saying there. There are no silver bullets in agricultural innovation. And even if you look at an example like the Green Revolution, it wasn't one thing. It wasn't simply breeding short-strawed wheat, rice and corn. It was the fertiliser systems, it was the irrigation, it was the pest management and disease management. All of that had to come together, and it didn't come together overnight either. You look at the no-till revolution in conservation agriculture across the world. In Australia, we have now 90% adoption of no-till agriculture, but it's taken 30 years to get there. And it's taken 30 years because it required a number of technologies to stack along the way: agricultural engineering, machinery, new short-strawed varieties, fertiliser management, herbicides had a big role to play there, new tillage systems. And so I think looking forward, the next green revolution will again be a case of what my colleague in Australia, John Kierkegaard, calls incremental transformation. So small steps that add up over time to a major change. When you look back and you realise you've made a big jump, and it's been because of that incremental progress over time. So I think nitrogen is a nice example, Heach, where I think we're going to see stacking of technologies like slow-release fertilisers, biological nitrification inhibition, both in the genes of the plant and maybe also microbes in the soil. Next generation precision ag, where we might be managing the individual plant, particularly in row crops, not just zones within a field, but actually the individual plant, and machinery being able to do that. Nitrogen fixing genes in non-legume crops like cereals and cotton. There is scientific progress being made on that front. And then finally, on-farm fertiliser manufacturing. So ammonia synthesis, particularly powered by renewables, will be another, I think, crucial part of the innovation stack. But, it'll probably take 20 or 30 years for us to get there. It won't be an overnight fix.
Mara, you had something burning?
Yeah, a burning.
No, maybe not the right term.
No. Cool insight. I totally agree with how Michael has framed this emerging kind of step-by-step revolution. There is one catalytic element that just happened, and it is so exciting, and that is connectivity through satellite connections. So for a long time, I think the 2016 McKinsey Index on Digitization across sectors had agriculture in Australia at the bottom, year after year. And that partly was because you couldn't get online on these massive properties, and everyone knows the challenge of the John Deere with 3 apps, and you integrate them back when you're on the field. Now the ability to ingest data means modeling calibrated by actual results through robotics can transform this incremental sort of shift. And the other comment, and it kind of connects both of you, Costa kind of, and I think it was your comment that red meat is not going away anytime soon, given the need for protein. Well, I encourage you all to read a super challenging paper. I'm a faculty member with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and Cambridge has been publishing on alternative proteins and the competitive dynamics of catapulting from red meat directly into. We have a wonderful debate going because one of the lead authors is my old boss, and we work together at Greenpeace, so you can imagine how exciting those conversations are. I think partly what will drive the agricultural transformation is competition from a values-aligned and rapidly growing tech sector, which is alternative in its thinking.
Thank you, Mara. And you know, we've heard about green revolution taking 30 years, incremental transformation taking another 20, 30 years. We had a conversation, Mara, around how indigenous groups and peoples of nations like Brazil, how they participate in not just the energy transition and the climate transition, but how can we learn from the indigenous groups around landscape management practices? Are you seeing any examples where we can take their learnings and incorporate that into our technological stack?
It is such an exciting question and so complementary. In Australia, we've evolved this fire burning methodology to reduce emissions by small burning techniques, which for thousands, tens of thousands of years, have managed our landscapes. We are now exporting that. There's a startup in Australia called Mackie, and it is taking this burning methodology into Africa, into the Americas. Very exciting. In Brazil, there is a tremendous movement. Everything from enterprises that gather seeds and transform them on the edge of forests to blend reforestation, right through to the ways in which the management of existing super important tropical rainforest systems can give us a shot at preserving the lungs, which actually bring water to the Americas. It's not just the greenhouse, it's a huge risk that the Amazon does. So between the preservation, the cultivation of reforestation, all of that is opening carbon and nature markets, which we hope one day will have higher and higher prices that actually reflect natural capital, and we hope will be tradable with confidence about what harmonization actually looks like. Very early days, but our two nations are in super important positions to show the world how we can do this.
Heecha, in New York at Climate Week, I met this fascinating Sri Lankan woman who'd been in private equity for 20 years and now was doing the most extraordinary research-based investment. And that is, she was going around to indigenous communities and spending a lot of time with them trying to understand indigenous knowledge when it comes to products and processes. And then bringing her finance background to think about how do you make these things ethically investable. And I think that's a really fascinating area for us, which we have to tread carefully because we don't want to overly commoditize indigenous knowledge to the point where it becomes worthless. But thinking carefully about how do you create investable products based on indigenous knowledge, I think it's a really interesting development.
And maybe can I add to that, because the CEFC will shortly announce an incredibly significant First Nations-led natural capital transaction up north. For me, it's not, we extract knowledge, but actually it's ownership and equity that's super critical to First Nations engagement. It is not just the extraction of their history and culture, but actually them controlling that information and having that deep equity stake in that business. And that's how we unlock First Nations engagement.
And I think, here in the pavilion a few days ago, we had a beautiful, moving conversation about the spiritual values that humans that live in natural ecosystems bring to their wisdom of the future that actually we need You know, this is a values as well as commercially driven discussion.
So when I think of all this innovation, I think it's extremely exciting. But of course, Costa knows more than anyone else on this panel how difficult it is to scale up technology. And Michael probably has a perspective on this as well. So, you know, what are the key challenges for technology companies like yourself face to scale up?
So probably the best way to think about this is the different skill sets between 0 to 1, 1 to 10, and 10 to 100. 0 to 1 is generally a scientific breakthrough of some kind. You can make it in a lab. 1 to 10 is the proof of concept. 10 to 100 is the really hard part. That's the scaling up. I think there is a secret to this, and in 0 to 1 and 1 to 10, there are sources of capital that can help you get there. In agriculture, you have highly regulated markets, or you have capital-intensive solutions. Both of them require quite a lot of capital up front. Those sources of funding are available, and they can get you there. But to go from 10 to 100, the secret sauce is customer money. You have to have built something that people want and that they're willing to pay for. And in order for technology companies to essentially survive the valley of death, which is after the early money and before the big revenue, you need a bridge. And the best way to do that is to demonstrate to future customers that you're creating value and get those customers to support what you're doing. That's the trick. The second part of that is to echo what Pradeep was saying about supply chains. In agriculture, it is not, you cannot implement a solution as a solo actor. You need collaboration across the full value chain. There are links in the food system from the agricultural input companies to the farmers themselves, to the big processors, to the CPGs and the retailers and the restaurants. And you need alignment across that full value chain in order to roll out technologies. And so not only do you need to show the value and get the support from the customers, but you need to embrace that collaborative activity to bring everyone together so that it can be implemented.
Thanks, Costa. And Michael, how does CSIRO think about commercialising some of the science that's coming out of your organisation?
Well, we commercialise when we want to achieve an impact. That's our mandate the Australian government gives us. And if a commercial path is the best way to achieve that, we will partner with commercial entities so that delivery can be accelerated and done in a sustainable way too, right? So companies like Ruminate will only survive if they can make money out of this and be incentivised to scale. Can I just return though to the question around scaling too, Heach? Because I think we often forget that there's been some deep thinking over the last 50 years about what drives adoption on farm from technologies. And it feels like we sort of need to relearn the lesson every 5 years, I feel sometimes. A lot of it's around giving farmers the opportunity to trial technologies at a small scale that's low risk for them, that they can learn about whether it's going to work in their circumstances, and then help them scale it from the small trial or pilot so that they can gradually get more confidence that it will work in their system. And science can help with that because it can help with the insights around the trialling, provide the data, the insights about why something's working or why it doesn't work actually, and give some sense about farmers' ability to then stay with the technology. So there's all the sorts of things Constance was talking about, but there's also the on-farm question too around how we help producers scale and adopt.
Thanks, Michael. And just on that scaling and the financing needs and not falling into the death valley, the ag sector drives nearly a third of global emissions, as we talked about today, but it receives a fraction of public climate finance annually. Like a fraction, we're talking potentially 5% or less of global climate finance going into an asset class that won't transition with an energy, an energy transition will not decarbonise the sector. It's, we talked about, it's the technology stack. So other than the sector being so decentralised, which, we heard about family farmers, both in Brazil and in Australia, being one of the factors in the lack of finance going into the sector, perhaps perhaps a question for Pradeep and Mara. What do you think are some of the barriers that we need to overcome to have more flows of finance into supporting low emission practices?
So it's a really important question. As a student of the evolution of pricing carbon and the steps forward and backward around these different trading systems, it's very interesting that none of them include agriculture. The New Zealand system, until it was reversed, was the first, and that was into the future, never applied. And it's a strange kind of social barrier. Don't get in the way of farmers. They have political, influence. And yet, the land sector has so much to benefit. Because once it deals with enteric emissions, it becomes that sink that the planet needs, and that can be monetized in a very powerful way. So I feel like we have to have the courage, and as a dual Brazilian-Australian citizen, it's been very interesting to observe the Brazilian giants, JBS, Minerva Foods, others, getting on the front foot, signing up for SBTI. I really hope COP31 happens in Australia, because the Brazilians are coming, and they're coming with a message of the commercial, societal, ecosystem benefits of this transformation if you lead from the front. And we just have to change this story that somehow, climate change is a myth and it's bad and it's all too hard. No, it is the biggest opportunity the land sector has, and we just need to embrace it.
100% agree, and I think that competition coming from Brazil, I think, could be really important for Australia. A couple of things. We talk a lot in Australia still about natural capital, and still nothing much progresses. And Ken Henry gave a great speech the other day, again pushing this, the need for us to get more serious about this. We talk a bit about adaptation, right, as an investable area, and do very little about it. So let me maybe make a left field comment that perhaps one of the things we need to do better at is ensure we have more investment in our public institutions that facilitate investable products. So we spend a lot of time trashing public institutions like the Bureau of Meteorology, like the ABS, like CSIRO, like our university sector and the research they do. But one of the things about them is they create a lot of public value, and we don't drive that enough into sectors like agriculture. And I suspect one of the things that we could do to unlock capital in the agricultural sector is to actually strengthen our public institutions and drive the information that they generate much more into the day-to-day activities of the agricultural sector. So that's me being a little bit controversial, because I know it's a hot topic in the country.
I think that kind of research or scientific or academic translation into real economies is really important, and there are groups who are doing that at universities. So I think that's really important to unlock the value, as you say. And if I can give a bit of a plug for my colleagues at CEFC, one of the things we've been working with CSIRO for a long time now, maybe for a decade or so, is to bring some of the science in the ag sector to institutional investors. So recently we launched a net zero pathfinder for the agriculture sector. CSIRO developed it, and it identified key eligible activities that were available for concessional financing through National Australia Bank. And we are looking at how we support this across all the banks, because it's not proprietary to any of the banks. We deliberately funded it so CSIRO's work could be shared to anybody, actually. Even if you're not seeking finance, you can go and take a look at this pathfinder to work out how you create a net zero proposition for your farmland assets. And so it is, for me, it's building that capability as well as marrying it with a financial carrot that maybe we're hoping create some change. Mara, did you have something to say?
I am so excited by this kind of thinking. And the other collaboration that hasn't yet happened, and maybe CFC could play a role in this, in Australia we have a famous and very important levy system for R&D, pre-competitive R&D. All of our industry sectors are levied a small amount into a pool where they collaborate on common challenges. And I actually think we're at the stage on the planet where they need to collaborate in pre-competitive terms with their competitors. We have to find a way, and I understand it feels very competitive, but if the world's agricultural systems around commodities and value add could do that, that would just bring such catapulting. The final comment I'll make, I represent the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, OTPP, on the board of Australia's largest carbon nature developer, a company called Green Collar. The Canadians are deeply invested in farmland in Australia. They understand the value of the hedge and the bill. They are also looking in South America. They have the biggest Chilean cranberry production in the world using robotics, unheard of, in any other economy. We have to marry up Canada, Brazil, Chile, Australia, all the great agricultural companies, and together crack these kernels, because then it really becomes investable.
Well, maybe one final question, because we're getting to time. Nice segue, Mara. So I'll ask each of the panelists this question. If there was one policy action that you think could help scale up climate solutions for agriculture and food production, what would that be? Pradeep, I'll start with you. Give everybody else some time to think now.
I think it's this idea of public institutions. See, one of the key things for finance and innovation is information. And we don't spend any time thinking about the role of information, the value of it, the cost of it, what it means for the ease of doing business, particularly around innovation. And I think if we crack the nut on understanding the economics of information in the agricultural sector, then I think we'll get far greater investable products.
Very good. I'm going to say fast-track regulatory approvals for new technologies. Having been a director of the APVMA, the regulator for ag-vet chemicals, if Australia could approve ruminates technology, it looks like Brazil's going to approve it first. How funny is that? And probably India, probably China, right? Australia needs to wake up to the urgency of regulating these new technologies faster.
Couldn't agree more.
Are you going to agree with Mara on that?
I'm going to agree with Mara. The Australian system has a gap in it, and the other countries are going to move faster. But I think about regulation in two ways. I think public policy in two ways. Firstly, we shouldn't forget where we are. There's deep wisdom in the Indigenous community here in Brazil. Deep wisdom. And the panel that Mara led the other day was an example of that. The Indigenous perspective is to be custodians of the land. And we have not got that in our public policy, not fully. So there is a role for governments to play to curing the externalities from industry that have led to emissions. We should not lose sight of that. We need regulated global carbon markets. It's politically difficult, but from first principles, it's essential, number one. Number two, we should treat methane and CO2 differently. Methane is a fast-acting, high-heating, short-term opportunity. And we've treated methane in CO2 equivalents. There's an error there that needs to be corrected. So I'd say regulatory approvals, carbon markets, and split gas accounting.
I only just asked for one, but anyway, you can have three. I'll give it to you.
Might as well, wish list.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's created a precedent now, so I'm going to have a big long list. I agree with everyone said here, but my one would be encouraging government to back a few more winners, particularly as the investor, on behalf of the Australian people, where technologies and agriculture will both return productivity and profitability dividend to the farmer, but also a public good outcome in terms of greenhouse gas emissions or some other ecosystem services type outcome. We're a bit too hung up, wouldn't you agree, Pradeep, in Australia around the government backing winners, even though Mariana Mazzucato's thinking has been around now for quite some time. And we bring her out to Australia and tell her how wonderful she is, and then she goes home and we don't do anything based on the government intervening in markets and being willing to back companies like Consters, but also others that are going to develop technologies that will make farming more profitable, but also produce a dividend in terms of the environment.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe I'll add one final wish list. My wish on that is, having worked with many institutional investors, the thing that will unlock investments is stability, is policy stability. And in any, I guess, societal transition where policy needs to shift and behaviours need to change, you have to create an investment environment that is stable and predictable. Without it, you will never grow or scale up investment strategies in any meaningful way. So
you've got to change the parliamentary term?
well, I'm just going to say that
She didn't go to New York Climate Week.
investors are very, risk averse. And so all of this innovation and technology and new markets need policy. They're policy driven necessarily. And I think that's great and I welcome it. But we need stability. If you want flows of finance and big licks of capital, like Ontario Teachers, or from Lacasse, who I work with, or some of the other Australian pension funds, I think somebody from Wallamai talked about $4 trillion worth of Australian superannuation money that needs to, flow into investment opportunities. They're only going to flow in a stable investment environment because it is wealth management ultimately that they are responsible for. So that's what I'm praying for, is more policy stability in this sector.
Let us pray.
But anyway, I will leave that unless I'm not sure whether we have time for any questions, but if there are any questions that are, burning, please put your hand up and I'll grab the mic.
Hi everyone, Nick Dord from Arena. Fantastic panel, so much I could jump into, but I'll put my renewable energy hat on, and with so many farming and ag experts at the panel, I would love to hear the panel's reflections on what we see as a perceived or possibly manufactured tension between renewables and farming, between ag and the, I think, Mara, as you put it, a sort of, well, I would translate as you put it, a mythic power that the farmer has in the Australian imagination. It's sort of, I akin it to the way the US venerates its veterans. We have a similar approach, I think, to farmers, and there's a big gap there. So keen to hear the panel's thoughts.
Start with Pradeep, given your land comment.
I think the division is more manufactured than real. If you look at a lot of our farmers have understood the changing climate far better than we give them credit for. They've been modifying their practices quite significantly. And so I think there is actually a lot we can learn from our farmers in dealing with this. And the more we get away from this manufactured conflict between our farmers and the renewable push, I think the better. We see this in terms of debates about transmission and farmers. Certainly, I think I can't understand why we haven't got the framework for better agreements on land use with our farming community, because I think more of them would be more willing to get some return from a lot of their land. But I think the key here is, I think we've got to flip it the other way. We've got to go and learn more from our farmers as opposed to accepting the conventional wisdom of there being a conflict.
Costa, did you want to say something?
Just a quick add. We need to always be conscious of false trade-offs. There aren't any ors. It always needs to be yes and. The trick is to put the money where the highest impact is first. So it's about capital allocation towards the impact, and that should break down. That should be the great equalizer to allow us to speed up and avoid the false choices.
How about you?
So, and what a great way to add another policy change. So, famously in Australia, we have a subsidy for diesel fuel, and it exists for our mining sector and our farm sector. And in Brazil, we have the most commercially advanced biodiesel. A company called B8 is changing the world. And if we could be so simple-minded as to say that subsidy for diesel also applies to biodiesel, we would not only transform farming systems that struggle to electrify where at-scale renewables may not yet be part of our grid, we can change the Pilbara mining sector, get them off the diesel and onto so much collaboration is possible.
Thank you. Michael, do you have any comments about
I'll
that?
just say, Dick, I think there's always going to be a noisy small minority in the farming community that worry about any change. And it's all about having control over their domain. And I think we've seen some good examples where there's been very poor management of the process, where big public projects have been rolled out and a lack of consultation. So I think we should learn from that. But most farmers I talk about are excited about the prospect of having free energy potentially on their farms if they can tap into the renewable revolution, and they see huge advantages in that.
Thank you. Any other one question before we have to roll off? Nope. Well, thank you to my wonderful panelists. It was a wonderful discussion, actually. I was surprised myself. Anyway, I'm sure the panelists will be happy to take any separate conversations or questions from the audience or any interested party this week, and you know, WhatsApp, Teams, whatever it is. Anyway, thank you. Please help me thank my panelists today. Thank you.